This is the first chapter of this video series, 50 Years in China. The reason I made this series is that China's rise is a hot topic recently, so I hope I can share my thoughts on the issue. And for 30 years, I've been learning everything I could from the Western world, especially from America. So I think it's time for me to share something back, to give something back. In recent 40 years, China went through a big change. I was born in 1975, so this big change was pretty much my life. So I hope I can provide something valuable to those who want to understand China a little better, especially those who want to understand China not just superficially. For that purpose, I made this video series more like a book. It's not about China's appearances, like cities or landscapes or how people live their lives in China. It's about something deeper, something more profound. So maybe this video series is not for everyone. It's going to be very long. For some people, it could be even boring. But unfortunately, it's inevitable. This is how this world really is. Everything is complicated, especially when we talk about a giant country like China. It takes time and effort. So I want to give you something that can make things a little more clear and dispel some most common misunderstandings about China, so China will stop being a strange thing to you. If you chose China to be your enemy for any possible reason, it's still beneficial if you understand China a little better. Like Sun Tzu said in The Art of War, understand yourself, understand your enemy, you won't lose any battle. So let's learn something about China. The title of this chapter is Open or Close. And I think you can guess what I'm trying to say here. One of the fundamental reasons of China's rise is that Chinese finally opened their minds and they began to learn from the Western world. The whole thing began after the First Opium War in 1840, when China was defeated quite easily by a tiny navy from Britain. 7,000 soldiers against a giant empire. You might think that Chinese began to open their mind immediately after that, but it wasn't what happened. At the same time, in East Asia, Japan also had quite a similar experience when they contacted with those Western superpowers. But the Japanese responded way faster than Chinese. They pretty much opened their minds and they began to learn from the Western world right away. This is kind of like a Japanese tradition because this wasn't even the first time they did it. About 1300 years ago, during Tang Dynasty, Japanese already did it once. They learned everything from China. The writing system, Confucianism, even the hairstyle. They learned pretty much everything. And they finished a transformation. So in 19th century, Japanese did it all over again. Only this time they learned from the Western world. Again, pretty much everything. And they finished the transformation, turned Japan into a superpower. In the case of China, the situation was way more complicated because China was huge. The territory was huge, the population was huge. China was like a giant train, Acceleration, deceleration, changing the direction, always took time. So it was the beginning of the 20th century. Chinese began to open their mind. Lots of Chinese began to open their minds. They went to Europe and observed the European countries with their own eyes. And that immediately triggered a big change. There was a very strong tradition in China, food binding. Lots of Chinese women had to make their feet very, very small. For Chinese, of course, it was the tradition. But when they went to Europe, they were shocked because Europeans had very different opinions on this tradition. They call this tradition barbaric, they call this tradition cruel. And as a proud Chinese, those people were humiliated. So when they came back to China, they decided to do something about it. They decided to eradicate this ugly tradition once for all, and they did it. They started a campaign against this very old tradition, and they encouraged the younger generation to abandon this practice, especially younger mothers. Encourage them to stop doing this on their little girls because foot binding has to begin at a very early age. So what happened was that this very old tradition was eradicated in China permanently in just one generation. That was how fast sometimes changes could be made. But unfortunately, Chinese didn't keep their minds open after that. The reason was multifold. Chinese have to deal with so many things back then. Civil wars, invasion, and more civil wars. It was a complicated age. So in 1949, the modern China was established. But instead of opening minded this time, Chinese actually closed up again. China was isolated from the rest of the world for 3 decades. Then 1980. 1980 was a time when everything began to change, and this time for real. This time Chinese not just opened their minds, they kept their minds open for the next 40 years, 1980s, 1990s, and the first 2 decades of the 21st century. And during this time, many Chinese moved to those rich countries and sent information back. It created a cultural movement. And the most glaring feature of this movement was that the information from the outside world, from those rich countries, was overwhelmingly positive. And I mean that. You probably won't believe this, but it was the truth. Overwhelmingly positive. Not even a single negative word about those rich countries. To the point that many Chinese, I'm not going to say most of the Chinese, but at least many Chinese deeply believed that something ridiculous, like America was so rich, they paved their streets with gold. Rationally, of course, you knew that it was ridiculous, it was impossible, but subconsciously you just tended to believe these kind of things. Because you live in this environment that everything about those rich countries, especially America, was overwhelmingly positive. This movement had positive and negative effects on China. I'm going to talk about the negative effects in the later chapters, so this chapter I'm going to focus on the positive effects. You see, since 1980s, Chinese began to compare China with every other rich country. As long as a country did something better than China, Chinese would condemn China and cry for a change. I give you a few examples. Some people, let's say, visited Japan and noticed that the streets in Japan was super clean. Then people would ask for a change. Or let's say some people went to Germany and noticed that the trains in Germany was always on time, very precise. Then people would complain about it and ask for some changes. Most of those people actually made great points because back then China had tons of problems. The streets in China was definitely dirtier, and the transportation system in China was a nightmare. You see, in 1992, I went to Beijing for my college education, so I took trains all the time, and they were always delayed. I remember the worst scenario happened in 1994 when I went back to Beijing. The train was delayed for 7 hours. That was how terrible the transportation system was in 1990s. But of course, things have changed a lot. Now, the streets in China, if you visit China one day, you will notice that the streets in China, in any city actually, are always very clean. Probably not as clean as Japanese streets, but they are pretty impressive. And the transportation system in China is definitely amazing, definitely top notch. And that's the results of a comparison, actually extreme comparison. Because for 40 years, the Chinese have been literally comparing China with pretty much every rich country. But majorly, Chinese compared China with America, the most powerful and the richest country in the world. Let me tell you two examples that shocked Chinese in 1980s and the 1990s. It was two lawsuits. The first case, a man sued the government, and the government lost the case and had to pay this man like millions of dollars. The second case, a woman sued a shopping mall because she fell and broke her leg. And the shopping mall lost the case and had to pay her like millions of dollars. These two cases shocked the Chinese because they all contained something that Chinese couldn't understand back then. So in the first case, Chinese couldn't understand what? They couldn't understand that the people were allowed to sue the government. This, never happened in China. For thousands of years, Chinese government, it was like a god, You don't sue God. You cannot sue God. It was unthinkable. It was even blasphemous, In the second case, what Chinese couldn't understand was the reason this woman sued the shopping mall. She sued the shopping mall because the shopping mall didn't have a sign to warn the customers about the slippery floor. But for Chinese, it was kind of like bizarre, because for Chinese, it was your own fault. You fell, it was your own mistake. Why should the shopping mall take the responsibility? But under the influence of the cultural movement, everything about America was, overwhelmingly positive. So most Chinese believed that if something happened in America, it must be right. You just have to figure out why. And that's what Chinese did. They tried to figure out why this happened in America. And the lesson Chinese learned from the first case was that, of course, people should be allowed to sue the government. After all, what is a government? A government is just a bunch of people. People make mistakes. And of course, people should be held accountable for the mistakes they made. The lesson Chinese learned from the second case was that if the shopping mall made its floor very slippery, of course the shopping mall should, notify the customers about it. It makes perfect sense. How should I know the floor is slippery? It's your job to tell me. So now the lessons were learned. Chinese wanted to make some changes. For the second case, the change had been made so fast. It took probably like 2 or maybe 3 months. One day I went to a supermarket and I saw a big yellow sign at the entrance. It said, "The floor is slippery and be careful." That was how fast the change had been made. But the response to the first case wasn't that fast. It took years, even 20 years. But eventually, change had been made. Nowadays, Chinese definitely can sue the government. From time to time, you see news about people suing the government. It doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen. Okay, I'm gonna end this chapter now. The point I want to make in this chapter is very easy to understand. For 40 years, Chinese kept their minds open and they kept improving things as fast as they could according to what they learned from the Western world. And that is the foundation of China's rise. Without this foundation, China would have no chance to rise, or at least not so fast. So at the end, I want to quote from Su Dongpo. He said, 不识庐山真面目，只缘身在此山中. It means I don't see the full picture of this mountain because I am inside this mountain. It is the truth. When you're inside this mountain, you only see details. So sometimes we need opinions from outsiders. If I learned something from Chinese history, that would be that China had been stuck in its loop for thousands of years until some outsiders taught Chinese a lesson, and then Chinese began to see a new possibility. And that is supposed to be a lesson not just for Chinese, but for everyone.